Good day to you, listener. I hope this episode finds you well. This is episode 2 of our Four Great Champions two-parter, and today we'll be focusing on Daniel Mendoza and John Jackson. Now, you'll remember when we left pugilism last time, Slack the Norfolk Butcher had just taken the title from Jack Broughton, and we spoke about how this marked an end to the meteoric rise, I suppose, of pugilism under Figg and Broughton, and to a lesser extent other guys like Taylor. And we'd also spoken about how pugilism had become its own art form, removed from the backsword and the quarterstaff. You weren't so much dealing with weapons masters anymore as you were dealing with fully fledged pugilists. Now, the years after Slack took the world title, or the London prize ring title, were not good for pugilism generally. Slack was a shady character, not a particularly pretty fighter to watch either, where Broughton was constantly praised on his science, Slack was praised on his power, and it was famous for what's called the chopper, which was effectively a back knuckle blow designed to either close the eyes or open up cuts. Slack was also apparently a frequent user of blows to the back of the head, and apparently blinded a couple of guys doing this. Because the optic nerve and all that good stuff that you can hit in the back of the head doesn't respond well to being smashed. But Slack was a tremendous hitter, and people appreciated that. For a while, to slack someone was to hit them hard, just as Admiral Nelson, the full Nelson, and the family of Nelson holds are all named after Admiral Nelson. To put the Nelson on someone was to give them a damn good thrashing. But over the next decade or so, after Slack wins the title, it's mainly a mess. Slack's students win and lose the crown in increasingly suspicious ways, and basically all patronage leaves the sport. Where Broughton and Figg had both had earls who patronised them, gave them money, allowed them to start up their amphitheatres, and allowed them to place substantial side bets on their bouts. That had all disappeared with the arrival of Slack, partly because Broughton lost the Earl of Cumberland, an enormous bet at 10-1 odds against Slack, which put him off it personally, but also let everyone know that this was a very dangerous betting sport. So the titles passed around for a long time, and there's stories like that of Waterman Lyons, which we touched upon last episode. He was a ferryman on the Thames, and he became the consensus champion of London, and then he decided it was actually more cost-effective to just stay as a ferryman, and he basically threw the title in the slot bucket. Well, it wasn't a physical title at the time, but he just abandoned the prize-fighting game. You got other interesting tales from around that time. Peter Corcoran is a particularly interesting one because he was the first Irish world champion. Basically just walked around England as a labourer. It was a terrifically hard puncher by all accounts, and depending on who you read, he either won the title from Bill Darts with a very quick knockout, or he won the title from Bill Darts by driving Bill Darts' head into the ring post in under a minute. If you remember the Nazim Hamed Marco Antonio Barrera fight, he gets a half Nelson and a hip grip on a swinging Hamed and drives him into the corner. Now imagine that if there weren't a big puffy thing over the turnbuckle. And of course, back in the day, a lot of these were fought in fenced areas as opposed to roped areas. You would build a stage for a fight. At any rate, boxing does begin to make the transition, or had for a while, when Broughton was around, into a gentlemanly pastime. And while that disappears for a while, when all the money disappears from this sport and it goes back to being sort of, well, as in Figg's day, you had the upper classes coming in for the big fight between the Gondolier and Whitaker, and for interesting things like that, but he also had to appeal to the underclass a lot with the mutilation of animals and so on. But there's a great story from the late 1700s. Francis Hayman, who was a very successful painter, he was commissioned by the Marquis of Granby I don't know if the Granby roll is named after that. It could well be, because there's a lot of wrestling moves named after old lords and earls. But the Marquis of Granby is set to pose or to do a sitting for Haymon, to be painted into a portrait for this Hall of British Worthies that Haymon is putting together. And he turns up on St Martin's Lane, which we discussed last week, where all the painters hung out, and the place where Old Slaughter's coffee house was situated. So he turns up in St Martin's Lane at Haymon's house, and he says, "Frank, before I do this, before I sit for you, I insist upon having a set to with you." And Haymon's quite surprised by this. He doesn't want to get into a fist fight with a Marquis, even though this is a commander-in-chief, so he's a military man, but you obviously don't want to be getting into fist fights with men of much higher station than you in case you upset them. Granby won't let this go, and he says, I hear that you're one of the last students of Broughton. I would just love to have a little spar with you. And Haymon insists that he's too old and he's suffering from gout, and the Marquis says, well, we're about the same age, and it'll do you good. Exercise is good for gout. There's a fantastic quote. He says, "Besides, a few rounds will cause a glow of countenance that will give animation to the canvas." So Haymon finally says, okay, let's do this, and they pop on the mufflers, as they were called. You remember Broughton introduced those, and they have a little spar, and Haymon decks him and dives to the floor with him before his wife comes in and says, what on earth's going on? But apparently the Marquis was suitably impressed, and they became firm friends. So that's a good little story, but that just shows that... firstly, that connection between gentlemen and boxing, and secondly, the connection between St Martin's Lane, Old Slaughter's Coffee House, and the pugilists. So boxing was still the gentlemanly art, but the actual sport of boxing had fallen in estimation enormously through men like Slack and Meggs and Darts, not very long-serving champions, and also champions who fell under suspicious circumstances, and when asked about it would say that they fell for money. So they didn't do themselves a great service there. But one man who comes along shortly after this period of very unremarkable boxers is a lad called Daniel Mendoza. And Mendoza is among one of my heroes. He's been a tremendous influence on the boxing game generally, on fighting as we know it. And in London, he was a superstar, or became a superstar. He was born in 1764 to a couple of sort of upper working class parents. He wasn't particularly hard done by, didn't live in the ghetto, but we're not talking an actual gentleman boxer here. We're talking about a lad from a fairly working class background. Now, one of the important things about Mendoza and Mendoza's life is that Mendoza was a Jew, and the Jewry had a hard time of it in London. They were, just generally in Europe, they weren't the most beloved class. And Mendoza stands out in the same way that there's people like the strongman Sigmund Breitbart and other Jewish people of athletic brilliance do. Obviously, there's a lot of stereotypes around Jewish shopkeepers, Jewish bankers, things like that. And Mendoza, as a genuine tough man, did a lot to counter the stereotype of the Jew in London. It's probably good to tie in a little story here with Benny Leonard, who was much later, we're talking 1930s, boxer. One of the best lightweights of all time. And he used to tell a story about how he'd come home from a boxing match, and his father would say, "Good Lord, look at your face. What have you been doing? Have you been getting into fights again?" And Leonard would say, "I'm sorry, Dad. I'm sorry. I just love boxing." And his dad would go, "Oh, goodness, you must knock this nonsense off." And Leonard would say, "Here's the $5 I made from it." And his dad would say, "Oh, so when do you fight again?" Mendoza's dad is a similar sort of character. He doesn't approve of fighting. He tries to set Mendoza up with a fairly safe life, sent him to an apprenticeship as a glass cutter at the age of 13. And this is where Mendoza's life takes on the sort of shape that it's going to hold throughout. Mendoza was the gentleman boxer. Everyone remembers him as this amazing gentleman and scientist. But his his own memoir reads like Alan Partridge's. Everything ends with a note of, needless to say, I had the last laugh. So he goes to this glass cutter, and he says that they were wonderful to him, and they treated him well, and the master of the house was a lovely guy. And he says that he doesn't like the way that the glass cutter's son speaks to him. So one day he determines no longer to submit, and therefore gave him a severe thrashing, though in his father's house. And having done so, I thought it prudent to imitate the manners of the great. I resigned my situation to avoid being turned out. So there, that's gig number 1 down the drain. Feeling the utmost aversion to a life of idleness, and unwilling to become an encumbrance to my father, I gladly availed myself of the first opportunity of employment that offered. So he goes off to work for a greengrocer now. And this is all in the same little Jewish neighbourhood. So he's working for the greengrocer, and the greengrocer's wife apparently keeps getting racial slurs shouted at her, and basically anyone who comes by and says anything negative, Mendoza challenges to a fight. Quote, in a short time, however, I became the terror of the gentry, and when they found that, young as I was always ready to come to her defence. They forbore to molest her. So then he ends up at a tea dealer's, and he fights his first professional fight in a ring with a side bet at the age of 16. And this is to do with the supplier coming by, wanting more money for the stock that he's brought. Mendoza saying, no, don't pay that, Mr. Tea Dealer, and challenges the delivery man, basically, to a fight. So they stretch up a ring, and for some reason Richard Humphreys is there, and Richard Humphreys is for a while the champion of England. So obviously Mendoza is training with decent boxers. He's going to the sparring schools. There's just no mention of it in any of his writings about himself. So midway through this fight, in Mendoza's own account of it, at least, people are asking Humphreys why he's not shouting advice to his charge, and Humphreys says, "There is no need of it. The lad knows more than all of us." Which I doubt for some reason actually happened. Maybe because this is Mendoza's own memoir, but the memoir is just full of moments like this where people admit that he's the greatest thing since sliced bread. But he always comes out on the wrong end of it by losing his job or whatever, and it's never his fault. He's that lad you grew up with who just couldn't stay out of trouble, and never really got that he was part of it. At any rate, Mendoza as a fighter is remembered for basically being the first modern boxer. He's recalled as a defensive genius. Back in the day, it was very negatively looked upon to even give ground, to retreat. To shift backwards was to literally take a step backwards, to change stance doing so. Mendoza liked that. Mendoza was a keen student of all sorts of defensive exercises. The story goes that he was the first to come up with the right hand parrying the opponent's left and the left hand parrying the opponent's right, which is just one of the building blocks of any sort of striking today. You don't reach across yourself, you deal with the same hand on the same side. What everyone notes about Mendoza when they write about him is that he had fantastically muscled upper body, but very, they even call them weak loins or legs and hips and waist. And this sort of flies in the face of what we think about punching today. We think that punching all comes from the floor. And in terms of a Jack Dempsey-style pure punch, where the body weight is transferred into the blow, that's true. But what Mendoza was a volume striker, essentially, one of the earliest ones. He valued frequency of blow and placement of blow over power of blow. And this is the polar opposite to Slack, who was a wonderfully hard hitter, but got into these hour-long matches, and it took him forever to actually find the mark with it. Whereas Mendoza was in the same sort of length matches and getting people out of there by attrition. Mendoza was also a fan of the chopper. He used to back fist people and hammer fist people, coming straight out of his guard. He was, when you look at the old school pugilism guards, even like the later days of pugilism, the lead hand is often very extended, and the right hand is held at the chest. That is because typically right hands would be swinging in and you would be trying to what's called bar the path of them by extending your left hand and raising your left shoulder. Sort of like the stiff arm, the leverage guard, the stuff we see from very good strikers today, but it was far more common back then because they didn't have gloves to hide behind and things like that. Mendoza's guard is quite interesting because he raises both hands in a very exaggerated sort of put-em-up style. And there's plenty of paintings of this. This was very well known as Mendoza's guard, and no one else seems to be doing it at the time. And if you've watched Nate or Nick Diaz fight, you will actually recognise this. There is a brilliant piece by John Nash, which I get credited for far too often. It's called The Pugilist, Nick Diaz, Daniel Mendoza, and the Sweet Science of Bruising. And it just goes through sort of the similarities between old school pugilism and what can be achieved in mixed martial arts with the smaller gloves, taking blows off the top of the head, as we talk about in Letway and things like that. And the raised forearm guard that Diaz does is the spitting image of the old paintings of Daniel Mendoza. The danger of raising your hands in an exaggerated manner like that, of course, is that while you've created sort of a cage of forearms around your head that aren't really very easy to swing through, you are exposing your body. So the way that this was done was that, you'll see this in pictures of Mendoza, his head is forward of his waist. Not a stance that's very conducive to drawing power from the legs, but the body is held further away than the head. Sort of like how you'll see Roy Jones Jr. or Anderson Silva lean forward at the waist in front of their opponent, presenting a false distance. So when their opponent steps in, they can bring their head back over their legs, or even lean back if they're really desperate to create some space, and the opponent will fall short, and as they're falling short, they can come back with a counter. But Mendoza, fighting without gloves and being a fan of the chopper, he wouldn't even need to get his head back over his stance before he started hitting. He could just backfist the guy or try and chop his eyes straight out of that leaning forward stance. You hear all sorts of other things that Mendoza enjoyed doing, such as dropping to a knee to get a breather whenever he felt like it, using his forearms to parry hard on opponents' straight blows, trying to injure their arms, particularly into the bicep. From the sound of it, he was a guy who studied every trick in the book. And the interesting thing about that is that, in Mendoza's own words, "I never was very attentive to training, but relied chiefly on my youth and the excellence of my constitution." And that's from a story where he's asked to go and train in solitude at a house owned by one of Humphreys' backers, and he turns it down because it's not his cup of tea. At any rate, Mendoza makes a name for himself, basically taking people apart over the course of, most of his fights seem to be about half an hour, which is fairly quick to finish an opponent in the days when you got 30 seconds to come up to the mark. So his volume, style, and accuracy were clearly cutting swathes through the pugilists of London. Now, the story of Mendoza is largely about a rivalry with Richard Humphreys. At some point, they fall out. Throughout Mendoza's memoirs, he makes reference to people saying to Humphreys in front of him, "Watch out, that boy will be better than you someday," and things like that. Eventually, they have crosswords and they fall out, and they get into a couple of sort of heated situations with groups of backers outside of the ring. Eventually, they agree to have a match, and over the course of 45 minutes, supposedly Mendoza gets the better, and then attempting to throw Humphreys holds on to the fence and reverses the throw and drops Mendoza on his head, injuring his legs in the process, or one of his legs. His loins, as they say in the papers of the time. And Mendoza can only go for a couple more rounds, is dropped a couple of times, and then that's the end of the match. And what follows is just the snottiest series of letters in the newspaper. And this is just... it's like a series of angry tweets making it to the front of Reddit today. It's hilarious, but far better written. So Mendoza sends this letter into the newspaper called The World in 1788, and it says, "Understanding with no little degree of anxiety that some gentlemen have disputed the propriety of my conduct on Wednesday last, in the battle between Mr. Humphreys and myself, I am induced to exhibit the following facts, on the proof of which I will hazard every credit due from a generous public whom I never have nor ever will deceive. At 10 minutes after 1 o'clock, I set to with Mr. Humphreys, and for 20 minutes I had most evidently the superiority, finding I could stop most of his blows, and though frequently closed by Mr. Humphreys, a mode of fighting I wished to avoid, I found the ability to throw him. My strength and spirits were superior to my adversaries until the last fall but 2, when I fell directly on my head, and by the force pitched quite over. I then found myself hurt in the loins, indeed so much that it was with extreme difficulty that I could stand upright, and by the last fall I received, was rendered wholly incapable of standing. Indeed, I was scarcely able to breathe, and it was with great difficulty that I could sit on the knee of my second. When Johnson asked me if I was done, I could answer him only by a sign. By this untoward accident alone, I lost a battle on which my warmest hopes were fixed. To my friends and patrons on that occasion I owe much, to the liberal opinion of the public I owe still more, the confidence of which I have never betrayed. With this assurance, I shall only add that if the world is desirous of renewing the conflict, and should Mr. Humphreys be willing, I shall be more than happy to engage him. Yours, Daniel Mendoza. Now this starts off quite nicely. It's a humble Mendoza, almost, but he does say, I was getting the better until Humphreys tried to throw me. Now Humphreys is understandably peeved by this. He writes in the same paper the next day that he, notwithstanding my declaration previous to the battle between Mr. Mendoza and myself, that whether I was beaten or I beat him, I would never fight again, yet as in this address to the public, through the medium of your paper, he has insinuated that in his late contest with me at Odiham, his being beaten was the mere effect of an accident. I do now declare that I am ready to meet him at any time not exceeding 3 months from the present date, on condition that, as it is merely to oblige him, and I once more enter the lists with him, the sum we fight for shall not be less than 250 guineas aside. The terms of fighting shall be exactly the same as the first, except the whole door money shall go to the winner of the battle. The stakes be held by the same gentleman as before. So Mendoza replies that he's more than happy with 250 guineas aside. He's more than happy for the winner to take it all on the door money. He's not happy that the fight be within 3 months. Mr. Humphreys will surely be informed that a complaint of the loins is sometimes an unwelcome companion through life. This proposition on one hand exhibits an hidden wish to prevent a contest, or on the other hand, a want of feeling that can do little credit to his most sanguine friends. So Mendoza says that he's declining this challenge, but he would put some propositions out of his own, which Humphreys could take up. First proposition is that I will meet Humphreys on the same size stage as Oldham, and fight him for 250 guineas aside. The second proposition, the victor shall have the door, and as the world is decidedly in the opinion that Mr. Humphreys is the superior in the art of boxing, the third proposition I make is, in italics, the man who closes first shall be the loser. And he continues with some prattle. Now this is a huge deal, because Mendoza considers himself the master in the art of boxing, and this is where you see him separating the art of boxing from the rougher elements of boxing, the closing, the throwing, the parts that made Figg and Broughton so successful. I mean, Broughton was a good boxer in his own right, but he was very famous for his cross-buttock throw, and Figg was more famous for his throws than for his punching. What you're seeing here is essentially the 18th century equivalent of Melvin Manhoef going into an MMA fight and going, oh, I hope he's not scared to stand with me, as if that will make the other guy stand with him. So Humphreys replies, essentially agreeing to the fight, but he throws in an amazing smack across the face to Mendoza in the process. He says, the proposition which sentences the first man who closes to be the loser, I must confess does not more surprise me for its absurdity than that it should come from the man who, in the last contest, was himself the first to close. Not to mention the folly of depriving himself of gouging and practising other unmanly arts. The effects of a defeated spirit. Whoever considers the above proposal must be surprised it did not occur to him to declare against hard blows, a mode of fighting which he could wish to avoid. But it is endless to trace the absurdities. Indeed, both this mode of reasoning and the nature of such proposals are such, that it is wonderful no one should have reminded him that the offering them to the consideration of the public must be deemed an insult, when it cannot be his interest to at least make a show of respect. Once more, I repeat it, I shall meet him only on the conditions stated in the first letter, with this additional one, that should I be beaten through accident, he shall give me an opportunity of re-establishing my credit in another contest. It is clear that should I accede to his ridiculous propositions, it would only be driving him to new straits, for the whole tenor of this letter only proves that parrying, not fighting, is the end of his wishes. Through the letters, which I've only read a few extracts from, Humphreys just comes off as so much Mendoza's superior in the smack talk department. But you're seeing a lot of what is even commonplace today. The attempt to negotiate the opponent into a position where they can't accept the fight, trying to take the whole door for yourself, the winner-take-all bet. Famously, James de Gale said that he'd give his whole purse to his opponent if they beat him, and then they did, and fortunately the opponent was nice enough to let him keep it. But you're also seeing attempting to manipulate the rules. The famous example I always give is Tyrone Spong fighting Nate Corbett for a World Muay Thai title, but refusing to allow him to use elbows. Or Muhammad Ali and Joe Frazier going back and forward over the clinch and trying to get a referee who would enforce the rules in the way that each camp wanted. And you're even seeing a little bit of that Conor McGregor, they turn into panic wrestlers against me, when Humphreys accuses Mendoza of being the first man to close for the throw. And indeed, Mendoza was thrown from a position attempting to throw Humphreys. Humphreys even goes as far as saying, at first it was his ankle, and there were people who could have sworn that they saw 3 of the bones come out. The disorder moved gradually to his hips, from whence, lest it should be mistaken for a rheumatic complaint, it is settled, with the most excruciating pain in the loins, where I am aware that it may abide for as long as he finds it convenient. So even drawing aspersions on the nature of how injured Mendoza is. And of course, finally, you'll notice that Humphreys included a rematch clause within that last letter. He said that should he lose by accident, which of course, however he loses, he's going to claim it's an accident, exactly as Mendoza has. He gets a chance to restore his credit, which is a clever thing to do because Humphreys has already tried to retire having beaten Mendoza. And Mendoza before this, when he'd got married to his wife, he promised her that he would only ever take a fight if it was Richard Humphreys, and then Richard Humphreys called him out. So you're seeing this sort of trying to cut and run, but keep being drawn back in. So in keeping with the tradition of relying on wealthy backers, Mendoza goes to visit with a wealthy gentleman called Sir Thomas Price in Upminster in Essex for the purpose of exercising and training. And they decide upon Stilton in Huntingdonshire as the place for the second fight. And on the 6th of May 1789, the crowd gathered there for the event. Now, the venue for the event this time is on the land of a Mr. Henry Thornton, who was a wealthy chap who built the 24x24 stage for the bout and seating as of that in a theatre. And the arena of sorts could handle a capacity crowd of 3,000 people, and that's what they reckon they got for that. And they charged half a guinea entry. So if you start thinking about that door price compared to the 250 guineas that each man was going to earn based on the on turning up to fight, it starts looking a lot more important that winner-take-all bet on the gate. So remember that each man has a cornerman, a bottle holder, and in this bout an umpire. And for his umpire, Mendoza chose Mr. Price, Thomas Price, sometimes called a priest in Boxiana, but Mendoza gives his name as Price. While Humphreys had a guy called Harvey Christian Coombe Jr., and their job was to basically act as 2 referees in the case of a dispute, and there was a dispute. Going by the Boxiana account of things for now, because I don't want to go with Mendoza's account of things all the way through. It's very clear that the loin injury has not affected Mendoza that much. We are talking about Mendoza at the height of his abilities here. So Humphreys comes out and throws a powerful facer, as they call it, which is a blow to the face, and is immediately parried and countered and sent to his knees. And the same thing happens in the next 2 rounds. And the spectators can't get over just how fluid Mendoza's move from defense to offense is. Over the course of the next 20 or so rounds, Humphreys takes a hellacious beating, isn't able to close to get the throw or anything like that. And in the 22nd round, he takes a knee without a blow. And before the bout, the two had agreed that anyone who performed an act of dropping, which both had been guilty of in the past, that's going to a knee when a blow clearly hasn't landed, to get the rest, to get the extra almost 30 seconds before you have to be back in the fight. So the backers of Mendoza said, that's it, the fight's over. And the crowd said, that's it, the fight's over. But the backers of Humphreys said, no, it's not over. And the two sides debated over this furiously for about 20 minutes. And this whole time, Humphreys was recovering. And finally, Mendoza decides that he's probably going to lose more face if the crowd decide that he didn't finish off Humphreys, or that there was some kind of controversy. So Mendoza says, okay, let's continue the fight. And Humphreys comes back in, well rested. And after about 30 minutes, Humphreys falls again and is unable to rise, and Mendoza is deemed the winner. One of the things that Egan mentions about Mendoza, in relation to his countering of anti-Jewish sentiment, is that when a man was falling in the ring, Mendoza would often hold his arms out because he didn't want to hit the guy on the way down. But that simple act did more for Jewish relations in London than a lot of things in the last 50 years had. A third fight is agreed upon in September 1790. The two fight in Doncaster, and you'll notice they're getting further and further away from London here. because the magistrates did routinely threaten to break up these fights. This was still an illegal pastime. And they end up fighting at an inn on the river, and they fenced off all around the ring, and they charged half a guinea to enter once again. And poorer locals realised that they could just go to the other side of the river and look in from the river. So there was a lot more freeloading of that one. In the second bout, there had only been one instance of someone sneaking in, a guy named Futural, who may or may not be the same guy we talk about in a minute when we're talking about John Jackson. Mendoza's other notable fights were his 2 victories over Bill Warr, W-A-R-R, might be War, might be Warr. Bill Warr was a very respected pugilist. He was every bit the scientist that Humphreys was. He was bigger than Mendoza, as most of Mendoza's opponents were, and Mendoza saw him off twice with very little difficulty. And part of what makes Mendoza so remarkable is that he was fighting all comers and beating them all, and he was 5'7" and about 160 pounds. So this is not a Broughton Fig Slack style figure we're talking about here. This is a small guy. Perhaps Mendoza's most effective advertisement for the art of boxing was in going on tour with a circus company, the Aston Circus, and Mendoza travelled around England and Scotland exhibiting his art form, and he himself says that a lot of what he did was to exhibit the various styles of other famous pugilists, such as Big Ben Brain, Humphreys, of course, and men who'd come before him. And if you remember the Anderson Silva video of him showing the styles of other fighters, that was a big hit on YouTube a few years ago. People like that sort of stuff. One of the big moves of Mendoza's career was to stay on with the circus when they went to Ireland, and being a Jew in London was hard, but being a Jew in Ireland would be very, very difficult. A staunchly Catholic nation, not an awful lot of Jews there at the time. Now, the stories go that there were pirates trying to board his ship on the way over, and he decked some of them, and a lot of it just reads like something he made up on the boat over, out of boredom. But the one story that really stands out from that time is his fight with Squire Fitzgerald. Mendoza arrived, and he was teaching sparring there, and a chap called Fitzgerald heard about this English champion, and he said, I don't care who he is, I can beat him in a fight. Went down to where Mendoza was giving exhibitions and demanded a fight. Mendoza said, okay, if you wear the gloves. Fitzgerald said, I'm not wearing the gloves. Now, this wasn't Mendoza being cowardly. This was Mendoza realizing that him beating an unknown was hardly going to make him any money. No one was going to pay for the gate. It wasn't advertised beforehand. He wasn't making a large side bet with anyone's money. So there was very little to gain for him. And if he fought without the gloves, cuts and bruises heal very quickly, but broken fingers do not. And he wanted to hit Fitzgerald with gloves so that he didn't hurt himself. Fitzgerald finally agreed, and Mendoza gave him a drubbing. And by all accounts, Fitzgerald was a perfect gentleman afterwards, and very impressed. But Mendoza's first trip to Ireland is often credited with part of the love of the sport taking hold in Ireland. Even though Peter Corcoran had come over to England and become a champion, the sport was still not very big in Ireland. It was still very much a London thing, if anything. Not even an all-of-England thing. Now, the end of Mendoza is a cautionary tale, and it's a case of Mendoza being ahead of his time so far that the rules were behind it, which I'll explain in a second. But first we'll introduce John Jackson, who is the final of our 4 pillar champions, our 4 pillars of early pugilism. John Jackson is the son of a successful builder who put up several bridges in very famous areas of London now. He works as a labourer for much of his life, and eventually takes his first pitched battle against a guy named Futural, which is also the name of the only person who attempted to climb the fence and sneak into the second fight between Humphreys and Mendoza. We don't know they're the same person, but that would be a fun biography to read if it was. Now, Jackson didn't have much training in pugilism at the time, but he was, by all accounts, a physical specimen. He was 5'11" and 14 stone, which is almost 200 pounds of muscle, and the feats of strength attributed to him are ridiculous. Reportedly, he could sign his name with an 80-pound weight dangling from his little finger. God knows how you'd end up trying that. I imagine a pub bet of some kind, but certainly a feat. So Jackson beat Futurall, and he had one other fight after that in which he injured himself. But in just his third fight, he challenged Mendoza, and that's quite a step up in terms of opposition. Mendoza was still the man to beat. Now, Mendoza had taken some time off. He'd built himself up a bit between the second and third Humphreys fights. He recounts that the crowd were surprised to see how much muscle he'd packed on when he took his shirt off for the third fight. But he'd been off touring with the circus and doing all sorts of other stuff. And this exact same thing happens to John L. Sullivan, who I'm sure we'll look at soon enough. And if Ronda Rousey comes back in terrible shape after making movies, we can say the same thing happened to her. But Mendoza was a little removed from his best years of fighting. Now, you'll recall that Mendoza made that attempt to ban closing to throw in the second bout with Humphreys, which Humphreys deemed ridiculous because the rules of boxing allow you to throw. That was a case of Mendoza preferring a style of boxing which was almost futuristic. He was an outfighting counter-fighter. He didn't like the rough and tumble elements of boxing. He liked what we would now call the boxing itself. But there was something else about Mendoza that was a break with tradition and ultimately ended up costing him. Mendoza kept long flowing locks of curly hair, and you will recall from the pictures of Broughton and Figg and Taylor last episode that all of them kept their heads very closely shaved. So after a couple of good rounds with Jackson, who was much larger and about 5 years younger and in peak condition, Mendoza gets his hair grabbed. And Jackson realizes that Mendoza can't do anything about it, and when he's got a hold of his hair, Mendoza can't move away. So he holds Mendoza's hair and he pounds away, and in 10.5 minutes, which is an embarrassing figure for the time, Mendoza is stopped. And Mendoza gives the number as 17 minutes, but everyone else gives the number as 10.5. So that tells you a little about how embarrassed Mendoza was by that. But Mendoza's importance as a pugilist can't be understated. He changed much of the way fights were fought. Boxiana notes especially that young amateurs coming up really liked imitating Mendoza, because you can't imitate the size of John Jackson or the power of a Slack or Corcoran or someone like that. But Mendoza never seemed to need power. He just needed to be in shape and to time guys and to wear them out. And he often got better results knocking guys out than the big powerful hitters did. Mendoza was, by the time that he retired from the sport, he was well and truly beloved. He had a pub of his own in central London. He tried his hand as a shopkeeper, but it hadn't really worked out well for him. But he was apparently the first Jewish person to ever meet, in some accounts, a modern monarch, in other accounts, just George III. If you're an American, you will remember George III as the tyrant. If you're English, you'll remember George III as being nuts. He had acute intermittent porphyria from inbreeding, which firstly makes your poo go blue, but also causes madness for periods. So if you've ever seen the play or the film, The Madness of King George. Actually, it was called The Madness of George III until they made the film, and they realised that Americans would think it was a sequel, so they had to change the name to The Madness of King George. But that's George III that we're talking about. And Mendoza was the first Jew ever introduced to George III. George III didn't seem particularly interested in pugilism or boxing, but George IV, who was the Duke of Wales at the time of the Mendoza fight, was a huge supporter of John Jackson. Even though John Jackson only had 2 fights when the Duke met him, and only had 3 fights in his career total, he garnered the support of the Prince of Wales. And this is why Jackson is so important, because he makes boxing not just a science, but a gentlemanly pursuit. He begins what is called the Pugilist Club, which becomes one of the main forces for betting, setting up matches, actually teaching boxing to both gentlemen and regular people. The Pugilist Club is a long-standing feature in the future of fighting, through the days of Tom Cribb, Tom Molyneux, all that stuff in future. Pugilist Club is there throughout it. But Jackson was a famous teacher of pugilism. He really used his celebrity to improve his standard of living and to make himself into a gentleman. He was called Gentleman John Jackson. When you remember the Duke of Cumberland and the Duke of Bath and the Duke of Peterborough getting involved in early pugilism, you had one big patron. Jackson, he knew the Duke of York, the Duke of Clarence, the Duke of Queensberry, the Earls of Albemarle and Sefton, Marquess of Worcester, Duke of Beaufort, Marquess of Tweedale, Lord Craven, Lord Somerville, Lord Barrymore, Lord Fife, just a list and lists of peers, basically, and a very good friend and the boxing instructor of Lord Byron, he who is famously mad, bad, and dangerous to know. It was Byron who referred to Jackson as the Emperor of Pugilism. So Jackson became an incredible figure, even without having that many fights. And that's one of the most important things in fighting generally. It's not always how consistent you are or how many fights you have, it's who you beat and at what time you did it. Because in 3 fights, Jackson achieved more in terms of patronage and support of the people and the nobility than Mendoza could do in 30-something fights or Fig could do in hundreds of fights. But the dream of the prize fighter generally has always been to improve his standards and get out of the game while he's young. And John Jackson undoubtedly did that. He might have been the most successful example of that in terms of time put in and benefits reaped of anyone. In 1801, 7 years after Mendoza had lost to Jackson, he puts out one of those stinging paragraphs in a letter to a newspaper once again. And Jackson's letter just sums up where his life was, how he'd succeeded, and also, to a degree, how Mendoza had failed to capitalize on his beloved standing in the public eye. Sir, I was somewhat astonished on my return to town on Saturday to learn that a challenge was inserted in your paper on Thursday last, as if from Mr. Mendoza. Should I be right in my conclusion by believing that it came from that celebrated pugilist? I beg you will inform the public through the medium of your paper that for some years I have entirely withdrawn from public life, and am more and more convinced of the propriety of my conduct by the happiness which I enjoy in private among many friends of great respectability, with whom it is my pride to be received on terms of familiarity and friendship. Goaded, however, as I am, to a petty conflict, I hope that it will not be considered too much arrogance on my part to simply observe that after waiting for more than 3 years to accept the challenge of any pugilist, however dexterous in the science, and however highly flattered by his friends, I think it rather extraordinary that Mr. Mendoza should add a silence of 4 years to these 3, it being nearly 7 years since I had the satisfaction of chastising him. But Mr. Mendoza derived one great good from the issue of that contest. He was taught to be less hasty in forming his resolutions, more slow in carrying them into effect. This cautious and wise principle of action deserves much commendation, and having served an apprenticeship of 7 years to learn a certain portion of artificial courage, he now comes forward with a stock of impudence, the only capital which during that time he seems to have acquired, to force me to appear once more in that situation which I have for years cheerfully avoided. Reluctant, however, as I am to attract again, even for the moment, the public attention, I shall have no objection to vindicate my character by a meeting with Mr. Mendoza when and where he pleases, provided he'll promise to fight, and provided he'll also promise not to give previous information to the magistrates at Bow Street or elsewhere. I am, sir, yours and the public's most respectfully, John Jackson. And that really says it all. Jackson's withdrawn from public life. He's happy in the company of nobles and gentlemen, people like Lord Byron. Whereas Mendoza is struggling to get by. He ran his pub into the ground, and he was still fighting at the age of 50-something. Now, Jackson never did fight again, even when implored by young fighters. The champion of London became people like Jem Belcher was one of the next ones up. He was the grandson of Jack Slack, and nothing at all like Slack the Butcher. He was a handsome chap and well educated in the art and science of boxing, and generally beloved. But concluding our look at early pugilism, we picked 4 pillars, and rather than being equally spaced, they come almost one after the other with a big break in between the 2 pairs. James Figg was the man who took pugilism to celebrity status, basically, And even though he wasn't a pure pugilist, he was a weapons master. He found fame, and his amphitheatre was crucial in building the sport. He perhaps didn't see the direction that the sport was going in. By all accounts, he preferred competing with weapons and was much more skilled with weapons. But he was the man on the spot that made that happen. Jack Broughton was the man who made boxing into a science almost, and introduced the London prize ring rules. Or Broughton's rules were slightly different, but they were pretty much what the London prize ring fought on for the next 100 years. Then you had a large break after Slack beat Broughton, all the way up to Mendoza. Mendoza is the man who carried on Broughton's legacy, creating the science of fighting, and showing that volume often beat power. A powerful blow not landed is worth nothing. Several light glancing blows are worth more than one missed thudding blow. And finally, John Jackson, the man who became a celebrity, basically, for 3 fights. He became the emperor of pugilism. He became the teacher to the gentry and the nobility. He completely changed his circumstances, the son of a builder, and he died a gentleman. In fact, he was a page at the Prince of Wales' wedding, or later George IV's wedding. He ran in the company of lords and kings, basically. And that is everything that a fighter hopes to achieve, really. Social mobility through the fight game. At the highest level, you'll probably never see social mobility like that in the fight game again, even in guys like Conor McGregor or Floyd Mayweather. 4 men, 4 very different stories, but 4 pillars of pugilism. Right, thanks for listening to that, guys. Thank you once again for being my patrons and supporting the podcast. I couldn't do the Fights Gone By podcast without you guys. Hopefully going to have a big special one, like the very first one, for Alvarez versus McGregor next week. Let me know what you would like to hear about in future episodes of the history episodes. We could do some principal episodes, some patron-only male episodes. We can do whatever you want. I'd quite like to do Jack Johnson next, or maybe John L. Sullivan. We can do the history of MMA, anything to do with that you like. There's tons of subjects. I mean, I'm reading all the time, and I've got notes on almost everything I've read. So, if you have a subject that you like, honestly, if I've not read anything about it, I'll go and devour whatever I can about it, because I'm really enjoying the opportunity to put together narratives and spot themes and things like that. So thank you so much for your patience and your support. I couldn't do this without you, and I'm loving having this platform. Cheers.